Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. It's my great honor to greet you and welcome all of you to CIES 2023. My name is Jun Lee, CIES 2023 Conference Chair and President-elect, a professor at Western University, Canada. I'm so proud that this year we have recorded around 3,500 participants, with over 2,800 of them on site and over 2,500 new members. I just want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Aaron Benavot and our three CIES inspirers, Dr. Carolyn Hickman, Marcia, McKenzie, and Blanche, Verlie. I will leave the full introduction to Dr. Aaron. Before we can enjoy the first session of our Inspirations series offered by CIES 2023, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. They are American Institutes for Research, Childhood Education International, FHI 360, UNESCO Future of Learning and Innovation, UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development, University of Pittsburgh and Western University, Humanics International, NORAC, English Language Program, U.S. Department of State, Mathematica. Thank you very much, our dear sponsors. Now, please allow me to introduce the chair and the moderator of this session. We're honored to have Dr. Aaron Benavot to chair this session. Dr. Aaron is a professor of global education policy in the School of Education at the University at Albany, SUNY, with interest in comparative education research and international education policy. He recently worked as a Fulbright press specialist in Vietnam, 2018, and a high-level expert at East China Normal University in Shanghai. During 2014-2017, Aaron served as director of the Global Education Monitoring Report, an independent service evidence-based annual report published by UNESCO. I believe you're all familiar with that. Aaron's scholarship explores education issues from comparative, global, and critical perspectives, and has authored or co-edited 6 books. I will not repeat his publications because that will take much of time. Aaron previously taught at the University of Georgia and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and has been a visiting scholar at universities in Argentina, Japan, Germany, Italy, Malta, France, and China. He has given talks and keynote presentations in more than 40 countries worldwide. I cannot keep reading all of this because otherwise I just worry you will have time to enjoy the sessions. But Dr. Aaron does not really need my introduction. To many of you, you're already familiar enough about his interests, academic contributions to our community. Now, please allow me to leave that to Dr. Aaron. Aaron, please.
Thank you very much, Jun Lee, for that very warm and gracious introduction. I'm delighted to invite everyone to this first inspiration session, virtual inspiration session, that's entitled Why Politicize Education in a Climate Crisis. And I'm delighted also to welcome 3 wonderful speakers, Carolyn Hickman, Blanche, Verlie, and Marcia, McKenzie. Before I read a little bit more about their very fascinating backgrounds, let me just give a bit of a brief introduction about the session itself. Climate change education refers to concerted efforts, often in formal education institutions, but increasingly in social media platforms and other learning spaces, to help children, youth, and adults understand, address, mitigate, and adapt to the impacts of climate change and the ecological crisis. Among the overarching aims of climate change education is to foster reflection about and changes in knowledge, skills, attitudes, dispositions, and values in support of climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, and to spark a willingness to engage as informed and active citizens in various forms of public action and public participation. As interest and initiatives in climate change education have taken root and expanded, so too have the public discourse and politicization of such efforts in many contexts. Scholarly disagreements over climate science are being highlighted. Corporate efforts to stymie or sway public or educational debates are intensifying. Climate information and data of dubious provenance are being circulated, and the legitimacy of journalistic accounts is being questioned. Divisiveness and polarization of public opinion and even scientific fact regarding climate change are gaining traction. This session seeks to interrogate these processes. The expert panelists, all of whom have explored different aspects of the politics and polarization of climate change education and communication, will discuss the emergence, nature, and impacts of these trends. They will consider how education, be it formal, non-formal, or even informal, is influencing the hearts and minds of young people and adults. They will also speak to the relationship between education, social media, and climate anxiety and resilience. It is hoped that this panel will inspire scholarly debate, ideas for future research, and practical steps that educators and teachers might consider to implement as climate change education becomes embedded and increasingly contested in our lives. Please allow me to introduce three wonderful women who are scholars, researchers, analysts, and I'd say even activists in relation to the climate crisis, and who I believe can share insights about the politics and polarization of climate change education. First, I'd like to introduce Marcia McKenzie. She's a professor at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education at the University of Melbourne, Australia. She's a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. And since 2020, Marcia has been leading a large-scale 6-year, $4.5 million Canadian-funded partnership grant entitled Monitoring and Evaluating Climate Communication and Education, otherwise known as the MEES project. She's also director of the Sustainability and Education Policy Network, which is located in Canada. Her research areas include comparative and international education, global education policy research, and climate and sustainability education, including in relation to place, modalities, and affect theory. Secondly, I have the honor of introducing Caroline Hickman, who is a psychotherapist and a lecturer at the University of Bath in the UK, researching children and young people's emotional responses to climate change around the world for 10 years, examining eco-anxiety and distress, eco-empathy, trauma, moral injury, and intergenerational stresses. She is co-lead author of a quantitative global study into children and young people's emotions and thoughts about climate change, which was published in the Lancet Planetary Health Journal in 2021. She's been developing a range of therapeutic and educational tools for ecological distress, a psychological assessment model for eco-anxiety, and delivered workshops in climate psychology, emotional resilience, and mental health internationally. And third, Blanche Verlie is an Australian climate change educator and researcher currently living in Australia. She has over 10 years experience teaching sustainability and climate change in universities, as well as in community-based climate change communication and activism. Blanche has a multidisciplinary background, brings an intersectional feminist approach to her work, and is passionate about supporting people to engage with the emotional intensities of climate change. She's currently a research fellow at the RMIT University in Melbourne. And with these brief introductions, let me begin with the first question that I'd like to pose to our three panelists. In your view, has the inclusion of climate-related topics and themes in formal education become increasingly contested? To what extent is this contestation more or perhaps less apparent in the sciences or the social sciences? And in colleges and universities as compared to, let's say, primary and secondary schools? Who, in your view, are among the major dissenters of the inclusion of climate change themes in formal education, and why? Perhaps I'll begin with Marcia on that question.
Hey, thanks so much, Erin. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. I'm calling in from Warring territory just north of Melbourne today. And you do realize that one question has 4 questions in it, Erin.
Yes, I do. That's why I gave it to you, because I know you're very adept at this.
We'll do our best. So yeah, it's great to have this conversation with Blanche and Caroline and with all of you. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, I think this is an interesting session, and that there's lots of different things that we're looking at and different sort of trends that are happening that I think we'll cover throughout the conversation. So I think this question is pointing to different contexts around the world where we're seeing pushback against climate action in cases of, say, increasing right-wing populism. For example, the US is a case where we see that. We've seen that at the national level, and in particular states. But overall, I think as a question, the first part, or answer to the first part of this question, I think we're seeing globally trends towards increased uptake of climate in education and formal education, both in K-12 or primary and secondary education, as well as in higher education. So I would say, the global trend is an increasing realization that's coming from both youth, anxiety and desire for action, as well as communities around the world that are already being impacted significantly by climate change. And as a result, there's a push, there is the social will and the push for policy and curriculum to address climate. So in the work we've been doing with the MIS project, for example, we've looked at, and also UNESCO's done studies along the lines of this. We're looking at national curricula and the extent of inclusion in climate, and our current research on with our project shows about 43% of countries around the world where we have data are addressing climate change in some facet in their curriculum. So and that's, we're seeing a push, say, with UNESCO and globally to motivate more countries to take this up. So I think the overall trend is on the increase, but if you start looking country by country or region by region, you see that there are dissenters, and if, for example, in countries like the US, it'll vary significantly by state, which I can go into more. But yeah, I don't want to talk too much, so maybe I'll pass it off to someone else to answer other parts of the question or add on to that.
Maybe Blanche wants to tell us a little bit about her perspective from Australia around these questions.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I don't have the same perspective as Marcia about, say, being able to compare sort of across time or space. But I think from my perspective, I'm not sure if contestation is increasing or decreasing, but I think that the nature of that contestation is changing a bit. And it's not that we don't still have people saying climate change isn't real. It's a hoax. That's still happening, but I think that's by increasingly fewer people, and it's being given less airtime. So I think we're kind of merging into the space of, so how do we understand climate change? What are the causes? What are the solutions? And how do we go about teaching that? So I think that the contestation is around a more precise approach to particularly the kinds of ideologies that underpin the way that we frame the problem and the solutions. So one bit of research that I find really valuable is Emily Eaton and Nick Day's paper in Environmental Education Research on petropedagogy, and it talks about how the typical ways that we frame responses to the climate crisis in education are sort of depoliticized, in the sense that we don't talk about the structural causes being fossil fuel extraction and capitalism, and instead frame the solutions as, you know, kids should learn to recycle better and do a lot of individual behavior change things. But that, you know, really we know that on the whole, even if everyone did that really well, it doesn't stop corporations digging up and burning fossil fuels. And I think it's very difficult for teachers, particularly in school systems and particularly in countries that are fossil fuel producers, to be bringing that kind of level of analysis that is a lot more explicitly political to students, where the task becomes not, you know, go home and, you know, recycle, but it's like, well, how are we going to shut down fossil capital? And so I think there's a big change there in terms of the politics of what we're suggesting that young people can and should perhaps be doing. And I think that's sort of the challenge going forward is, are we going to just skirt around the real issue and placate young people by giving them non-solutions that take a lot of their time and energy but don't necessarily really address the problem? Or are we going to really equip them with the critical analysis skills and the change-making skills to address it? And I think that's a really tough ask, but that it's a really critical one.
Thanks so much. Appreciate very much your response. Caroline, would you like to add to this conversation so far?
Yes, and I'm grateful to go third because really great things have already been said. So I'll just sort of pick up on a couple of things. We have to keep in mind, don't we, that schools will mirror the societies that they're part of, and they're not separate from societies. And what I'm seeing in that mirroring is this false binary, this kind of extreme opposite polarized positions taking place, both in society and in schools. So I've been in webinars in the last 6 months where teachers and parents have told me geographically where certain teachers and schools are banned from talking about climate change. It's disallowed. So on the one hand, you've got some schools where they're not allowed to talk about it at all, ever. It's, you know, we had a motion tabled in the UK House of Parliament a few years ago to ban teachers from talking about it in school. So immediately, as a psychotherapist, as a psychologist, I'm going to say, what are we doing then? You know, this isn't just a question of education. This is going to have an enormous impact on young people's mental health if we ban them from talking about something that is an abject reality. So it is strengthening, but I think what's strengthening is the polar opposite false binary arguments about it, which I think fits with what both Marcia and Blanche are talking about. And then schools are caught in the middle of this about not knowing always how to navigate those pressures and those tensions, and frequently turning to delivering facts and figures rather than dealing with it relationally, because this has a huge mental health impact and schools are under enormous pressure. So on the one hand, you know, we can go to the advice of spending time in nature can reduce climate anxiety. And I know we're going to talk more about that shortly. But on the other hand, young people are in suicidal despair about the destruction that they and the deaths that they see around them. And there's a real risk, I think, that the education system could greenwash at the center of this and present simplified solutions. And that is a political danger, I think, that we all have to find a way through. And we need to support teachers and parents and other educators in not falling into that, not making it neat, because this is an essentially messy problem that we've got.
Thanks so much. Kind of moving back to the formal education system.
Marcia was waving, and so I'd love to see what you're waving about.
Sorry, I missed you there, Marcia. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to come off Carolyn and Blanche's comments there, just to come back, circle around to another part of your question, which is around the sciences versus social sciences. And whether how climate change is being taken up and in relation to those. And just to say that, originally a lot of what was done as climate change education was developed by climate scientists. And, it was really just thinking we just needed to tell people about the science of climate change. And once people knew, what it was and that it was happening, that there would be action. But we now know that doesn't work, and that more knowledge of the facts of climate change doesn't necessarily lead to, increased concern or action or political mobilization, because political identification and affiliation and those kind of cultural factors are more important in terms of whether people take it seriously and want action. So I think it helps us recognize the importance of it being across the curriculum where that's possible, and it not being a science issue, but a broader issue. And we know from the research as well the importance of framing climate change in relation to the narratives, the stories, the priorities that different groups within the community would have, and different political identifications as one possible, inroad, recognizing these barriers of that Carolyn was just speaking about when teachers or schools aren't allowed to address climate change. For example, we found it in the US examples in, say, South Dakota, where the only time climate change is in the curriculum is to say that it's not something that should be covered at school. It's for parents, like evolution, that they don't cover it in school because it's a contested topic. So, yeah, thank you.
I would just want to add one little point to you. I mean, I don't want to stop the conversation, but it seems to me that in these, we have many historical cases where a topic is incredibly contested and considered to be sensitive, everything from evolution to religion to, sexuality education. I mean, the list kind of goes on all kinds of various topics. And often we see in those kinds of conditions that there's another whole set of educational learning spaces or things outside of school that kind of take in they come into this vacuum where schools are in kind of separating themselves. And now, because of social media, we have, opportunities for young people to be, kind of encounter just so many different kinds of facts and other things that are related to climate change education. So in some sense, the power of the formal educational experiences, and let's call them informal or non-formal educational experiences with respect to climate change, seems very acute. And I wonder how each of you would kind of characterize this tension between, let's say, the formal educational frameworks and let's call them social media and other extracurricular experiences that young people are having in this area. Let me start with you, Blanche.
Yeah, sure. I think so. Recently, a colleague and I organised a special issue on the school strikes for climate, and so part of the kind of one of the themes coming out of that issue was how much young people said that they learnt so much more from their participation in the school strike movement than they had at school. And so that is both including, the social media and the online organising that goes behind actually showing up on the day and having that political mobilisation. But I think, for us, it was, I think that we need to take those school strikes not just as sort of young people saying, hey, we care about climate change, but really think about the fact that they are leaving school to do so, and that for them, walking out of school is necessary for them to have the say that they want to, and that actually participating in school is evidently not offering them what they want or feel that they need. whether that's, you know, through kind of the curriculum of learning about things, or just the kind of ability to have a say and make change. So yeah, I think that's a really, you know, radical criticism for education, that kids are teaching themselves. And that I think that really reflects quite a failing of the education system, which is not to say that there aren't individual teachers or even individual schools doing a great job, but on the whole, students have had to go to quite extreme lengths to find out what they feel they need to know and to find a way to make the change that they want. And I think just connecting back to the other conversation around the sorts of conversations that are suppressed, we're seeing young people all around the world organising around the idea of climate justice, which connects to questions around racial justice, global inequality, gender justice, and those sorts of things. And again, that I think is something that even when it's not connected to the climate change discussion, we're seeing that being cracked down on it in states like Florida in the US and in other places under the sort of anti-woke regime. So when we're not allowing students to explore issues like Black Lives Matter and those kinds of things, we're also preventing them from engaging around conversations on climate justice because they are all interconnected. So yeah, I think it's fortunate for young people that they have access to the internet and social media given those kind of constraints. Which is not to say social media doesn't have challenges either.
At the very least. Caroline, would you like to contribute?
Thank you. I'd love to. I'd love to follow Blanche on that. And I've got a couple of really, I think, hopefully interesting illustrative examples. So one young woman, she would be very pleased. I've checked with her if I say a little bit about what I've been talking with her about for the last year, which often her therapy sessions are often centered on how to negotiate time out of the classroom and not fall behind. So she has to negotiate with her teachers to catch up and to do exams if they're on a Friday because she wants to be on strike on a Friday. And this young woman is learning these extraordinary skills of negotiating with her whole school and teachers in order to do this. I've asked her if, she'd like to run the country because the negotiating level skills that she's demonstrating are incredible. She doesn't want to fall behind, but she wants to organize, but she has to deal with all her teachers and show respect and emotionally regulate at the center of this because she's driven by her passionate convictions and her anxiety about climate change. And she's just admirable and extraordinary. So I don't think we should underestimate the way that young people, as Blanche has said, are engaging with these additional learning opportunities. And what these young people are frequently saying is the learning that they're getting from this engagement cannot be delivered in a classroom setting. That's one thing. The other thing I want to do is quote another group of children that I spoke with about 6 years ago, sitting in a park. And I said to them, what do you need from the education system? It was a mixed age range of children between sort of 12 and 17. And they were all activists at one level or another. And they said, okay, what we need from the education system is, apologies to all the geography teachers, they said, we don't need lectures on Oxbow Lakes because we don't know how that's going to really help us. What we need is lessons in how to build boats, how to build houses, which plants to plant, how to deal with environmental change that's going on, how to be helpful to the planet and the environment around us, how to grow food. They said, but we also need lessons in how to have difficult conversations with our parents, especially when our parents don't believe us or tell us to go back to school or tell us to stop worrying. And they said, we need lessons in how to lobby politicians. So what I loved about that answer from that group of children was they understood that kind of diverse nature of what they needed from education, taking them into this unprecedented world. And education there shouldn't be really modeled through adult eyes about what we think children need. We need to be putting children at the center of that question and asking them because they know what they need.
Oh, you're muted, but I think you're probably telling me to go. So.
Yes, I did. You can read my lips already, I think.
Great. Yeah, just to add on a bit onto this conversation, and then I'll turn to the social media piece as well. But you know, I'm thinking back to when the school climate strikes really got going a few years ago, and my daughter was wanting her class was wanting to go, and they, you know, had to put together a presentation to the teachers and convince the teachers there was a connections to the curriculum. But then in the end, it got shut down by the superintendents that they weren't allowed to go. No one was allowed to go as part of their class to the school climate strikes. And so it ended up kind of rolling into this opportunity where the superintendent came in and the students talked to them, and then they ended up wanting to do something. So like, well, how about we create gardening programs? And the students are like, that's not what we need or want. And so I think it's building onto what Carolyn's saying, a different type of education, but also I think hearing that students don't want, it's not even what's in the curriculum, but it's we talk about a whole institution approach to climate change. So it's not just what's happening in the curriculum and how that's works well for students and addresses what they need, but also that they want to see broader institutional leaderships. They want to see their schools becoming, reducing emissions, addressing climate change and climate justice, and in community engagement aspects, the overall governance and so on. So it's a bigger school and education system response rather than just teaching students about climate change, which in a lot of cases they already know and are very concerned. So that's one piece. And I guess in relation to, I think it's important also that we don't paint youth as with one, brush stroke or whatever, that there's a diverse youth obviously and diverse national contexts and regional contexts that they're in as well. And I think that ties into the social media, so that while on one hand, social media has been a great organizing tool, say with the Fridays for the Future and climate strikes and other mobilization around climate, but also that there are other trajectories online that feed into the kind of contestation and the growing kind of polarization around this issue, both for youth and more broadly. So in terms of the increasing polarization and kind of anti-science trends that we're dealing with climate change are growing through social media influences, as well as a kind of pro-climate action, but right-wing kind of eco-fascism is another trajectory of social media kind of influence around this. So yeah, there's a lot that could be unpacked there, but yeah, really interesting dynamics with social media and how it feeds into, and as a form, say things like TikTok that we're looking at with one project, but TikTok or other social media platforms as a form of climate communication that youth are engaging in and others are engaging in as well. So yeah, thank you.
Anyone else like to add a little bit on the social media side of things? I mean, I think Marcia's point is very apt that, we really, there are multiple pathways, multiple kind of communities, multiple neighborhoods of materials that are being communicated over different forms of social media that, think of my own daughter here, it's kind of like, people become kind of anti-vaccination, become anti-vax, and then, kind of a back to nature lifestyle, maybe vegans and whatever. In other words, there's kind of multiple ways in which these things also, I think, come together. And I do think, though, that a lot, I wonder how much, we are supplying or providing students with the abilities to kind of critically evaluate and assess some of the information that they receive on climate issues via social media. And if that's not a very important role that schools should play, and not, delegated to some, it isn't something you can expect families or, scouts or whatever, some other kind of non-formal setting to deal with. But, how do you actually provide students with an ability to assess the validity or the reliability or the sourcing of information that they encounter, especially visual information increasingly could also be, kind of crafted or I don't know if any of you wish to speak to that point.
I'll say what comes to my mind while I'm listening to you. And what comes to my mind is a point that I think Marcia and Blanche have already made, really, which is about leadership and the lack of leadership and the vacuum in terms of leadership around the climate and ecological crisis generally. And then I think Blanche has already spoken about the need to support students to critically evaluate the situation they're in and to navigate the ways forward with that. But, education as one of the professional groups, we could also include psychiatrists, mental health professionals, social workers, doctors, generally health workers, have a leadership role here as trusted figures. And there's, the research that you referred to that we published last year showed this massive, in 10,000 young people in 10 different countries, massive lack of trust in politicians to show leadership around the climate crisis. And although there may be pockets where we can find some trust, but that trust is debatable because politicians have different agendas to others. And then there's the whole question about where the power really lies in each of our countries. So I do think, I may not be answering your question, so I apologize, but I'm just saying what came to mind was the importance of education professionals and other professionals to show leadership and show young people how to navigate these questions. Primarily because I think we shouldn't be under any illusions. I'm going to be a psychologist for a second. This is massive. It's completely unprecedented. So if we have the arrogance to assume that we know how to deal with the climate and ecological crisis, then we're going badly wrong because humanity has never faced anything like this before. So if we use existing educational psychological models to try and understand it, we will get it wrong because it is unprecedented. I know it's an overused word. So we really do need to have the humility and the hubris to discover, and that opens up that possibility of new research, new ways of learning, new ways of discovering, and new ways of encountering it, which are not always through the Western lens, the Western mind. The Western medical model, the Western educational model is completely out of its depth, and it's partly why we're in this mess in the first place. So I really would like us to use this opportunity to radically rethink how we educate, how we heal, how we communicate about this, because the Western models, the Western mindset that we've been using is why we're in this mess. And it's that massively needs challenging above all else.
So I did, there's kind of two different segues here, but because I do wish to bring up the issue of climate anxiety and eco-anxiety that both Blanche and Caroline, and to some extent Marcia, has also been looking at. But there is a question from one of the audience, a colleague, Mark Ginsburg, a former president of CIES, who asks, how are different youth dealing with the counter climate change messaging that occurs in social media? What kinds of steps are you aware of that youth would take in order to rebut or counter or address these kinds of messages that they encounter in social media? Any of you wish to pick up on that question?
I can have a go.
Okay.
And I'm just reading Kim's question as well, which is also about social media. Look, it's not really my area because I find social media very destabilizing, so I try to stay off it myself. But But I think, you know, there's a whole, I think it's hard for adults to understand how young people engage on social media because they are, you know, digital natives and they've grown up and they have whole subcultures around how they use that. I think that the one example that comes to mind of the kind of response to anti-climate stuff is, you know, Greta Thunberg's takedown of that idiot misogynist guy recently on Twitter. And I can't remember his name, which is probably good, but you know, just so casually and not really fazed by the trolling. I think in a way they potentially have a familiarity and literacy that some of us adults perhaps more fragile when people criticize us on social media. And I think young people maybe have a bit more resilience around understanding that that's a thing that happens and that you don't necessarily need to buy into it. But it's not my area. The other thing that sort of comes to mind around the issue of social media, and Aaron, you were mentioning around how like young people's critical media analysis, like how to make sense of the information they're fed. Now last year there ended up being a sort of Twitter conversation around the premise that climate scientists who were talking about how bad the issue is are the ones driving young people who are doing that on social media, are the ones driving young people to be really deeply distressed, potentially suicidal. And I think there's really important questions there around, well, who's actually responsible for young people's distress? And it's not climate scientists, it's not climate change educators, it's the people who enable climate change to happen. So that's where accountability needs to lie. It's with politicians and the heads of fossil fuel corporations and the like. Nevertheless, you know, on social media, we don't have a precise ability to tailor who our messaging goes to. And I think there is an important role for teachers to be helping young people work out which discussions around climate change do you get value from at the moment. And if you already understand the issue and are concerned about it, you probably don't need to be following the accounts of climate scientists who are trying to tell other people how bad the issue is and to take it seriously. If you're already taking it seriously, maybe that's time to move on from that bit and start following accounts that are about solutions and helping you find your way in the world. So I think I think there's really important challenges there around how we tailor which people get which messages, because, you know, the message about how bad things are, it needs to be there. It's important that scientists are doing that work, but it's not necessarily the case that every young person needs to hear that all the time, or any person really.
Marcia, is there something you wanted to add?
Sure, I can add a little bit. I think there's starting to be more research on this, but not a lot yet, I think, in the education and climate communication fields, but say doing sentiment analysis of social media output on climate change and how people are approaching it. So, delved a little bit into it, but again, it's not, my primary area of research either, but some of the interesting things, I guess, that I've seen, for example, are, say, youth responding to eco-fascist posts on platforms and having sort of a counter-fascist hashtag to speak back to that, or things like eco talk on TikTok that is an NGO collaboration with the platform to create a space for youth and others to share messaging around this. But I think it connects to what Carolyn was saying about needing a different type of education. And just I guess what I was saying earlier too, that there are parallels to say what was done earlier in terms of Holocaust education, or when you're dealing with these major which obviously the scale of this is, more global, but where you have these incredibly difficult issues that are so devastating, and how people process it. And like Blanche was just saying, not wanting to just be in a place of depression, but seeing the hopefulness of it. So the types of messaging and for example, a lot of the studies that have been done, say on TikTok so far, are saying that a lot of the posts are very heavy, very kind of down, and hitting people with the devastation of it. And so how do we support or move some of that communication to more empowering places where it spreads mobilization and so on, rather than spreading despair. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things that can be looked at further around climate communication in these platforms.
So, Caroline, you and your colleagues have written fairly extensively about this issue of climate anxiety and eco-anxiety, even collecting information from quite a few countries. We had mentioned at the opening, the work that you did for the Lancet Planetary Health. I wonder if you would like to contribute, some of the things that you found from the work that you conducted. I know Blanche has also written a book that speaks to some of these issues too, but I'm particularly interested in kind of from a social, psychological viewpoint here.
Yeah, thank you. When I started researching the subject of climate anxiety, I had a very different view to the one I have today, because after a few years, I started realizing that what I was hearing was young people communicating about this in ways that I had heard for many years previous to that, young people communicating about trauma and abuse that they'd experienced within their families, within close, intimate relationships, which really drew me to think of it differently, which is where we ended up with the moral injury argument about this. Frequently, repeatedly, and I'm going to try and make this concise and not go on a rant, but it's not climate change or the ecological crisis that is causing the distress in children and young people. That is a huge misnomer. It's the failure of adults, the failure of people in power to act with integrity and honesty around it. Children and young people repeatedly, and so do adults, say, I would not be so anxious or distressed if people were telling the truth, if people were acting, if people were collectively taking action to do something about this. And it's that relational hurt which is causing the worst damage to children and young people's mental health. It's the fact that they're, on the one hand, they're looking with their eyes and they're reading about this and they're discovering what's going on. And then they're being told, stop worrying, go back to school. There's nothing we can do. Recycling will fix this. What's wrong with you? You're a snowflake. They're just being given these repeated damaging messages of your distress does not make sense. And it's that that's causing the damage and the harm. And it's really not all about anxiety. It is also the depression and the despair, but it again is a relational damage. It's relational hurt, because young people are being left, out of the statistics that we had out of the research last year, there are some devastating statistics. 10,000 young people, 67% telling us that they're anxious and depressed, 27% saying they trust governments. These are pretty devastating figures. But the one that really sticks with me, 48% of children and young people told us they were dismissed or ignored when they tried to talk about climate change. Right? So we're causing this hurt. We've created it, generations before me and my generation. And then we're dismissing and ignoring children and young people when they try to talk about how it feels and what they think. And then they're looking for solutions. That is what I unprofessionally or professionally call a pretzeling of your brain, really. On the one hand, we're hurting you. And on the other hand, the very people who are supposed to be protecting you are the people hurting you. And then dismissing and denying your pain. So I want us to really get under the surface of exactly what is it that we're doing when we cause this hurt and despair. And this dovetails beautifully with the climate justice arguments and the unfairness of this, and the fact that we're either criminalizing or pathologizing children and young people when we say it is their problem. It's our problem, and it is a moral issue. And how can then that back to the original question here, how can that not be a political issue? It can't not be.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to pick up this issue about the politics of climate change education and bring it maybe home to our society here, the Comparative and International Education Society, to bring out a bit of a contestation that I saw recently in a blog post that was posted just prior to the Transforming Education Summit that took place in New York at the UN in September. 3 colleagues wrote in their blog that they call on readers to resist the call to put climate change at the top of the skills agenda. They argued that a key UN discussion paper prior to the summit was preoccupied with the existential threat of climate change, mass loss of biodiversity, natural disasters, pandemics, extreme poverty and inequality, and so on and so forth, and that the recommendations that were put forward in this discussion paper, the first 3, all focused on incorporating climate change into the curriculum. The bloggers agreed that the world is changing rapidly and that, but rather than double down on fundamental skills that would be needed wherever it happens, the transformation seeks to put a climate change issue atop national education strategies and reforms. And they continued by saying, it's unclear how the average child in a low and middle income country benefits from more climate change content in their schooling, especially when environmental and climate protection are already included in science, social studies, civil and moral education, and so on and so forth. I wonder, I mean, you know, here we have something that really gets to the nitty-gritty of what a lot of kind of the political and policy discussions among comparative and international educators. I wonder if you might address, as it were, the bloggers and how they've captured or characterized, you know, as it were, this predominance of interest in climate change education, perhaps unjustifiably so. Marcia, do you want to start?
All right, sure. Thank you. Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, a couple of things come to mind. I mean, I think this themes we've already talked about, that I mean, youth are wanting to, it's on their minds, on their hearts, you know, for a lot of youth, and wanting to see this focus. So ignoring it, not covering it is not an adequate response, right? It's got to be there. And I think we've talked about that it needs to be there in more than just the curriculum for them, but they want to see leadership more broadly, and adults caring about this, taking action with the buildings, the emissions of the buildings, and all of those broader considerations rather than just what is in the curriculum. But also, you know, I think it's a bit of a you know, false, you know, it's not universally true to say that it's being taken up across the subjects in all countries or regions. That's definitely not true. In a lot of places, it's still just dominantly in the science curriculum or geography, where it's covered as sort of a natural phenomenon, and we're not looking at it in relation to other disciplines and areas, and how it's a cultural issue, how it's in literature, and you know, and that's all part of how we address it in a way that goes beyond just the cognitive kind of facts, the science of climate change, but to be looking at it as a value issue, a moral issue, and how, you know, the types of actions that can enable us, and how we work together, you know, as a society and across difference, and for political change and so on. So yeah, I guess those are some of the things to start up. And I think this comes back to Carolyn's early comments too, in terms of what, you know, are better, you know, math skills, really the skills that are going to be needed in the coming, you know, decades, or is it things like growing food and more kind of fundamental skills on the track we're on? It's not going to be, you know, business as usual. It's going to be, you know, well, who wants to think about it? It's, you know, but very awful future we're currently headed towards. So, yeah, what kind of skills will people need? I'll pass it off to my colleagues.
Blanche or Caroline?
Yeah, thank you. I'm wary that we're low on time, but I have a lot of thoughts about this. But I think one thing is, you know, literacy and numeracy education is not mutually exclusive with climate change education. You don't have to go and learn numeracy in one class and climate change in another. Climate change is a, you know, amazingly interdisciplinary problem. And we also know from so much research in education that inquiry-based learning is, you know, one of the most engaging, effective forms. So why we can't be doing literacy and numeracy through climate change. We have, you know, whole genres of climate change fiction that we can be teaching in English classes, for example. But I also think, I think it's disingenuous to say that young people in developing countries or the global South don't need to learn about climate change when we know unequivocally that they're the ones who are going to suffer the worst from climate change. And also that access to schooling is affected by climate change. So when we have floods, bushfires, you know, cyclones, schools are really implicated in that, whether that's because, you know, and this has all happened in Australia. We've had schools and universities who become evacuation centres. So they're closed for learning because they're housing people, or they're closed because it's unsafe for students to be there for days or weeks at a time, or they get burned down or flooded. And then, you know, we've had schools where that school won't exist anymore. And the impacts that that has on young people's education is, I mean, we don't even know yet. We don't have the research basis around that, but that's happening in a really wealthy country like Australia. And to think about the kinds of impacts that will have on young people's access to education where they really need it, I think if we're dismissing that, I think it's really irresponsible. And so I think, you know, as Marcia mentioned, like a whole school approach, but it needs to be a whole sector approach to not just trying to get young people to be better for the climate, but to be thinking about, you know, this is a world that young people are growing up in. They are at risk of harm. And schools are places that have a duty of care to young people. And we need to be thinking about making schools resilient and adaptive to climate change as well. So I think there's just such a bigger picture and discussion around this. And yeah, I can understand why literacy and numeracy is important, but I think it's a poor argument to pit them against each other.
Go ahead, Caroline.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Blanche. Again, this is an example of the false binary I was talking about. As soon as we start to divide these things, then we are lost. And it's a displacement away from what Marcia was talking about, where you said, and it really stuck with me, those words you used, Marcia, you said, who wants to think about it, right? And that's the center of what has to happen here. We need to be able to tolerate this and think about it and hold that tension, because we don't want it to be true. And yet we need it to recognize this. Climate change and exposure to climate change, which is affecting every child across the world differently, yes, but there isn't a child, there isn't an adult in the world that is not impacted by climate change today. And it's only going to get worse. It's now being recognized as an adverse childhood experience, which is the equivalent of exposure to terrorism or war. We are going to see more and more and more of this. We need to recognize what it is we're talking about. An adverse childhood experience doesn't just impact on the here and now on the child, but has long-term mental health impacts right the way through adulthood. So we're talking about the bedrock of what we're creating in terms of mental health in future generations. So we need a psychoeducational model. So where we're not dividing the science from the psychology, where we are enabling young people to know how to navigate this whilst feeling it at the same time and not splitting it off. We don't want to think about it, but we have to find ways for ourselves to think about it, which is partly what these conversations are about, to then support young people in developing that resilience and emotional intelligence so that they can navigate it and then their children can navigate it. Because it's not going away anytime soon. So it's the how can we approach this, and recognizing there isn't a person on the planet not impacted. Differently, yes, but we're all impacted and we can never go backwards. We're halfway through this story.
Well, it's clear that we could continue the story for much more than the hour that we've been allocated. It's been really wonderful to listen and have this conversation with all three of you. There's already quite a few interesting questions that we haven't been able to get to. So I do want to express my appreciation to all the listeners out there in the audience, and perhaps we'll find another way to address some of the questions that have been raised. But at this point, I'd like to, send my or express my heartfelt appreciation to Marcia McKenzie, to Blanche Verlie, and to Caroline Hickman for getting up early in the morning and for contributing such valuable wisdom on all of these, on this very important subject. And we look forward to continuing our conversation going forward. So thanks very much, both to the three of you and to all the people who have listened to this inspiration session.